The first time Elias Mercer saw the summit, he didn't feel triumph. He felt watched. It was supposed to be the cleanest kind of fear, the kind that belongs to weather and altitude and simple physics, the kind you can measure with an oxygen gauge and a barometer. But this was different. This fear had intention. He'd spent 2 decades chasing peaks that made other men pray. He'd crossed crevasses that whispered like open mouths. He'd slept on ledges no wider than a coffin. And still, he'd never felt what he felt on that mountain. The quiet certainty that something up there already knew his name. They called it a routine ascent, a tight window of stable weather, a classic route, a summit push, planned down to the minute. But then the radio started doing something strange, short bursts of static that sounded like breathing. Not wind, not interference, breathing. The team brushed it off. Batteries, ice in the mic, altitude messing with the brain. All the usual explanations men use when the alternative is too expensive to accept, that the mountain is listening. Then came the footprints. One set, fresh, too clean, too deep. Not crampons, not boots. Bare impressions, pressed into new snow as if someone had walked up there with nothing between their skin and the cold. Elias followed them because that's what explorers do. They follow questions that make no sense. He told himself it was a trick of light, a misread pattern, a leftover trace from some earlier team, until the footprints stopped at the edge of a sheer drop, and on the other side, impossibly, continued. And that's when Elias realized the summit wasn't the finish line. It was an appointment. The story you just heard is a fictional narrative created for entertainment. High mountains have always done something to the human mind. They shrink our arrogance. They stretch our courage. Up there, every breath is earned, every step is negotiated, and every mistake has a price that can't be argued down. Elias Mercer knew that better than most. At 46, he carried the kind of experience that doesn't show up in photos. Frost scars you only see when the gloves come off, memories you don't tell at dinner, and a quiet discipline that keeps you moving when your body begs you to stop. But this climb wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about proving something to himself he couldn't name. A question that had followed him for years, hiding behind every summit certificate and every congratulatory handshake. What if the worst thing you can find on a mountain is not the mountain itself? In this story, you're going to walk with Elias through whiteout storms and knife-edge ridgelines. You'll feel the confusion that comes when the rules of nature begin to bend. And you'll face the same dilemma he faced when survival demands one thing, but curiosity demands another. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Country, city, even just a region. I read them, and it helps shape what we explore next. And if you enjoy stories of survival, mystery, and the kind of discovery that leaves a mark, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It tells the algorithm to share these adventures with more people who miss the feeling of real exploration. Now, tighten your straps, check your oxygen, and remember this. Sometimes the summit isn't the end of the journey. Sometimes it's where the journey finally begins. Elias Mercer woke before the others, not because of excitement, but because his body no longer understood comfort at altitude. The tent walls snapped and trembled under a wind that never fully stopped. Every gust sent fine snow hissing across the fabric like sandpaper. The sound became a kind of clock, steady, impatient, counting down. He lay still for a moment, listening to the mountain breathe. At Camp 3, the air was thin enough that even turning your head too fast could make the world tilt. Elias reached for his watch by muscle memory, then paused. The numbers glowed softly. 02:11. 2 hours before the planned wake-up. He should have forced himself back to sleep. Instead, he slid his hand under his jacket and touched the small recorder in his chest pocket. It was old-fashioned, not much bigger than a pack of gum. A habit from earlier expeditions. He'd learned that when your brain is starved of oxygen, Memories fracture. You think you'll remember every detail because everything feels sharp and monumental, but later it becomes fog. He clicked it on. "This is Mercer," he whispered, so the microphone wouldn't pick up the wind. "Camp 3. Summit push in a few hours. Something's off. Radio interference keeps coming in bursts. Sounds like breathing. I know how that sounds." He stopped, hearing his own words, and almost laughed at the absurdity. Breathing through a radio. Men said strange things at 8,000 meters. Men saw things that weren't there. Men died following mirages. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Not in the ordinary way. His team was meters away in their own tents. This was different. Like the sensation of walking through a dark room and realizing too late that someone is already inside it with you. The zipper of the tent made a small scream when he opened it. Cold punched him instantly, a physical force. The sky was a hard black bowl scattered with stars, the kind you only saw when the world was stripped of moisture and light pollution. The horizon had the faintest trace of grey. Elias stepped out onto packed snow and looked up. Above Camp 3, the route climbed toward the summit ridge, an exposed traverse that cut across a face of ice and rock. In daylight it looked dangerous. In darkness it looked impossible. He could make out fixed ropes glinting faintly, fluttering in the wind like thin black threads. He turned toward the ridgeline and froze. There were footprints, not from his team. No one had left camp yet. The prints ran from the rope line near the tents and up toward the first incline, disappearing into shadow. Elias crouched, headlamp beams shaking slightly. The impressions were deep and clean, pressed into fresh snow that had fallen less than an hour ago. He knew that because he'd watched it fall, whispering down like ash. The shape wasn't a boot. It wasn't a crampon pattern. No sharp edges, no metal points. Just a smooth, rounded impression. Bare. His mouth went dry, and he hated the way his mind immediately tried to fill the gap with nonsense. A hallucination, a trick of light, a partial collapse of snow. Anything but the obvious. He rose slowly and scanned the camp. Nothing moved. Tents huddled like small pale blisters against the slope. The wind kept its constant low roar, and somewhere higher the mountain creaked, ice shifting under pressure. Elias leaned closer to the prints and followed them with his headlamp. They went straight toward the incline. A cold thought slid into him. If someone, or something, had walked out into that darkness barefoot, they were either insane or not human, and either explanation was dangerous. He took 2 steps after them, then stopped. He remembered the last briefing. The team leader, Raj Patel, had been clear. No one leaves camp alone. Not for a pee break, not for a better photo angle, not for anything. Elias turned back, heading toward Raj's tent. He knelt, tapped the fabric and waited. No response. He tapped harder. A muffled voice came through. "What?" "It's Mercer," Elias said. "Wake up. We've got tracks outside." Silence. Then a zipper. Raj's head appeared, face pale in headlamp light, eyes half-lidded. "Tracks?" Raj repeated, like the word didn't belong at this altitude. Elias pointed. Raj crawled out, boots crunching, and together they walked to the rope line. Raj stared at the impressions for a long second. Elias expected him to scoff, to blame snowdrift or human error, but Raj's expression tightened in a way Elias didn't like. "Those weren't there," Raj said quietly. "I know." Raj looked around, then back at the prints. "Could be someone from another team." "No other teams are above us," Elias said. "We're the top camp." Raj's eyes flicked up the slope and he swallowed. "Could be from below." "Someone got disoriented." "With bare feet?" Elias asked. Raj didn't answer. He leaned down, touched the edge of a print with a gloved finger. Fresh. Elias felt a twist of anger, not at Raj, at the mountain, at the universe, at the idea that after all the planning and oxygen calculations, something as simple as a set of impossible footprints could disrupt everything. Raj stood and exhaled a puff of crystals. We wake the others. No one moves alone. We stick to schedule. Elias watched the prints vanish into darkness. Do we follow them? Raj's gaze sharpened. We don't chase ghosts. Summit push in 2 hours. We go up as a unit. A rational answer. The only answer. And yet Elias couldn't stop thinking about the way the prints went straight into the night, as if whoever made them had no fear of the cold, no fear of the drop-offs, no fear of the thin air. As if the mountain belonged to them. They woke the rest of the team. Marta, the medic, Jonas, a quiet German climber who'd summited 2 8,000ers, and Keiko, a Japanese photographer whose calm at altitude bordered on eerie. When the group gathered near the rope line, their headlamps created a small constellation of light in the blackness. Marta knelt to examine the prints and frowned. "This is a joke," she said, but her voice didn't carry humor. "Someone trying to mess with us." Jonas shook his head. "No one would do this here. Not at Camp 3, not in this weather." Keiko didn't speak. She simply filmed, camera steady, capturing the prints from different angles. Then she panned upward, following their path into darkness. Raj cleared his throat, authoritative. "We're not delaying the push. We stay together. We don't take risks outside the plan." "Understood?" Everyone murmured agreement. Elias said nothing. His mind kept replaying the line where the prints disappeared. Fresh snow, clean edges. No scrambling marks, no hesitation. They had been walking with purpose. They spent the next hour checking oxygen systems, tightening straps, warming their hands. Elias forced himself to focus on routine. Routine was survival. Still, the radio hissed. At first, it was the normal crackle of altitude interference. Then, as they clipped into the fixed line and began the first ascent, it happened again. A short burst that made Elias stop mid-step. It was faint, not words, not a voice. A rhythmic, human-like inhale and exhale, transmitted through static. Elias raised his radio to his ear. Raj was ahead, climbing with practiced efficiency, and didn't notice Elias slowing. The breathing came again, closer this time, like someone had leaned into the microphone. Elias's stomach tightened. He pressed the transmit button. "Raj, radio check." Raj's voice snapped back. "Loud and clear, don't waste battery." Elias hesitated. "You hearing anything weird on the channel?" Raj paused, then, "No, keep moving." Elias lowered the radio, trying to tell himself it was nothing, but his brain had learned a certain kind of pattern recognition over the years. It knew when something wasn't random. The breathing wasn't random. They climbed in silence, a line of headlamps bobbing upward, anchored to the rope. The wind strengthened as they gained elevation, whipping snow into their faces. The slope angled steeply enough that every few steps Elias had to stop, lean into his poles, and force air into lungs that didn't want to cooperate. By the time dawn began bleeding into the horizon, the team reached a narrow shelf where the ridge started to form. An exposed section with a drop on one side and a cliff on the other. It was the kind of place where you didn't look down for too long. Keiko lifted her camera, filming the sunrise. The light hit the ice and turned it into a field of glass, beautiful, cruel, indifferent. Elias glanced ahead and felt his throat close. More footprints. This time they were on the ridge itself, stamped into snow that should have been scoured away by wind. The prints ran parallel to the rope line, leading toward the summit ridge. Raj saw them too. He stopped, headlamp now useless in dawn light, and stared as if his brain refused to accept what his eyes were feeding it. Jonas cursed softly in German. Marta's voice was tight. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore." Raj looked back at the team. "We keep going," he said, but his certainty had a crack. Elias stepped closer to the prints. Here, in daylight, they were worse, clearer, undeniable, human-shaped toes and arches faintly defined. too large to belong to a child, too narrow to belong to a boot, the kind of impression that meant skin had pressed into snow hard enough to leave detail. He followed them with his gaze, and his chest went cold. The prince stopped, at the edge of a sheer drop where the ridge ended in open air. On the far side, across a gap that looked impossible to cross without ropes or wings, the prince continued. Elias's mind stalled. The gap was at least 2 meters wide, maybe more, with a slope beneath that fell away into a jagged field of ice. No one jumped that in crampons, not in wind, not at this altitude. Yet there they were, prints as if someone had simply stepped over empty air. Keiko, always composed, whispered something Elias barely heard. "It's like the mountain has a path we can't see." Raj's jaw clenched. "No one approaches the edge," he ordered. "Clip in, stay on the line." Elias didn't move. He stared at the far side, at those continuing prints leading upward, and the sense of being watched returned. Stronger now, more specific, as if something had turned its attention fully toward him. His radio crackled again. This time it wasn't breathing. It was a sound like a person trying to speak through ice, words smothered by static. Elias lifted the radio to his ear, heart pounding. A single syllable broke through. His name, distorted but recognizable. Mercer. Elias felt the hair on his neck rise under his hood. He pressed the transmit button without thinking. Who is this? Static. Then the breathing again, slow, measured, patient. Raj turned. "What are you doing?" Elias swallowed. "The radio. Someone's on the channel." Raj's face hardened. "There's no one else up here." But Elias could see in Raj's eyes that he'd heard something too. Maybe not the word, but the shift in the static, the wrongness of it. The team stood on the ridge, wind tearing at them, sunlight climbing higher, and the summit looming above like the tip of a blade. Elias looked up toward the final ridgeline, where the world narrowed into a single point. And for the first time in his career, the summit didn't look like a goal. It looked like a place where something was waiting. And deep in his mind, beneath logic and training, a thought formed with terrifying clarity. What if the mountain wasn't trying to stop them? What if it was trying to bring one of them closer? The wind surged, and Keiko's camera strap snapped against her jacket. She steadied it, still filming. Then from somewhere above, too high to be any of them, came a brief flash of movement against the ice. A silhouette, upright, motionless for just a second, as if watching from the route ahead. And then it was gone. Raj's voice broke the silence, lower now. "We don't talk about it. We move." But Elias couldn't stop staring at the place where the figure had been. Because a moment later the footprints ahead, on the far side of the impossible gap, changed direction. They turned, and they started coming back toward them. Elias felt the blood drain from his face as he watched the line of prints reverse direction on the far side of the gap. In the first light of day, the snow had a bluish sheen, like bone under thin skin. The footprints, impossible to begin with, now carried something worse than mystery. They carried intention. Raj tried to force authority into his voice, but the mountain swallowed it. "Ignore it. Clip in. We keep moving." No one moved. Yona stood rigid, eyes locked on the far side. Marta's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Keiko's camera kept rolling, steady hands, disciplined breathing, yet Elias could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. The prints on the far side crept closer, one after another, as if whoever made them had turned around mid-walk and decided to return. They didn't appear fresh from nowhere. They were simply there, extending backward along the ridge toward the gap. Elias blinked hard, trying to force his brain to choose a rational explanation. Wind-carving patterns, shadows playing tricks, altitude hallucinations shared by a tired group. But the toe marks were too clear, the stride was too consistent, and the worst part, the prints on their side of the gap did not change. They stayed pointed toward the summit, as if something had passed them earlier without a trace of hesitation. Raj stepped forward, anchored to the fixed line, careful not to approach the edge. "We don't cross that gap. We stay on the established route." Elias stared at the route. The rope line led them along a traverse that bypassed the gap entirely, curling toward a safer section of ridge. The gap was a shortcut, a dangerous one, the kind of thing only desperation would attempt. Yet those prints had treated it like a step over a puddle. Keiko lowered her camera and spoke for the first time in minutes. "Raj," she said, voice quiet but sharp, "this isn't normal." Raj's jaw flexed. "Nothing is normal up here." Marta exhaled slowly, the medic in her trying to stabilize the situation with facts. "Oxygen deprivation can cause shared misinterpretations. We're all stressed. We're all tired." Jonas looked at her like she'd insulted his intelligence. "Shared misinterpretation does not leave toe marks." Elias lifted his radio, the plastic cold through his glove. It was silent now, as if the mountain had decided it had already said enough. Raj made the call. "We move. 5 meters spacing. No stopping unless you're in trouble. Mercer, you're second behind me." Elias hated how quickly his body obeyed. Training was a leash, and it pulled him forward even when his instincts screamed to stay still. They advanced along the traverse, keeping to the rope, avoiding the gap. The ridge narrowed until there was nothing but a blade of snow with open air on both sides. Wind slammed into them with a violence that stole breath and balance. Every step felt like bargaining. Elias kept glancing back at the gap. The prints on the far side continued toward it, closer, closer, until the lead print reached the edge. Elias's throat tightened. He expected a pause, some indication of physics, fear, reality. Instead, the next print appeared on their side. A bare impression pressed into the snow just a meter from the edge, aligned perfectly with the one across the gap, as if something had stepped over the void. Marta made a sound that was half prayer, half disbelief. Keiko's camera whirred louder, catching it all. Raj didn't turn around. He moved faster, like speed could outrun whatever had just crossed into their world. Elias forced himself to keep climbing, but his mind kept dragging behind him, staring at that first print on their side. It was too large. The toes were too long, the arch too deep, and it was fresh, not minutes old, seconds. The wind rose in a sudden howl, and when Elias looked back again, the new prints were already fading under spindrift, as if the mountain didn't want evidence left behind. They climbed another 100 meters, and the ridge widened enough for them to regroup. Raj raised a gloved hand, signaling a stop. Everyone bent forward, hands on knees, sucking air like it was being rationed. Elias checked his oxygen, flow steady. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the pressure of eyes on his back. Raj looked at each of them, his expression tight. "We don't talk about what we saw. We keep our heads clear. Summit is still possible if we stay disciplined." Jonas's laugh was short and humorless. "Disciplined against what?" Raj ignored him and turned to Elias. "You're steady." Elias nodded, though his pulse hammered with a different kind of panic, one that didn't come from exertion. Keiko stepped closer to Raj. "I caught it on camera," she said. Raj's head snapped to her. "Delete it." Keiko didn't flinch. "No." Marta's eyes widened. "Keiko, that might not be—" Keiko cut her off. "If we don't make it back, someone should know what happened." The wind shifted, and for a moment the air cleared, revealing the upper ridgeline above them. The summit was hidden behind a roll of ice, but the final approach was visible, an exposed spine climbing into a sky that looked too thin to hold color. Elias followed the line with his eyes and felt his stomach sink. There, near a rock outcrop far above, was a shape, upright, still. Not a climber in bulky gear, no bright jacket, no reflective goggles. Just a pale silhouette against the ice, too slender, too long-limbed. It stood with an ease that felt wrong at this altitude, like it wasn't fighting the mountain at all. Keiko raised her camera instinctively. The moment the lens pointed upward, the shape moved, not away, toward them. It stepped out of sight behind the outcrop with a smoothness that didn't match the terrain. Raj's voice cracked. "We're turning around." The words hit the group like a physical shove. Jonah stared. "You said summit." Raj's eyes burned with hard decision. "Summit doesn't matter if we don't come down." Marta looked relieved, until the mountain answered. The radio on Raj's shoulder crackled, though he hadn't touched it. A voice, faint and ruined by static, slid through the channel. Not English, not any language Elias recognized, but it sounded close, intimate, like it was spoken into his ear. Elias lifted his own radio, heart punching. The sound came again, and this time, beneath the distortion, there was a pattern, a cadence, a rhythm that mirrored breathing. Keiko whispered, "It's on our frequency." Raj yanked his radio off his shoulder and held it away, like it was contaminated. "Batteries, off, now." They complied, fingers clumsy in thick gloves. Elias clicked his unit off and felt the sudden silence press in, heavier than the wind. Raj turned his back to the summit. "We descend to Camp 3. No debate." They began down climbing, reversing the traverse. Elias went last, eyes constantly scanning behind them. Wind slapped his hood, snow stung his cheeks, and the rope felt like the only honest thing in a world that had started lying. When they reached the section near the gap, Elias's gaze snapped to the snow. The prints were gone, erased by wind, filled in, smoothed over as if they'd never existed, except for one. A single bare footprint remained, deeper than the rest had been, preserved in a pocket of shelter beside a rock. The toes pointed directly at Elias, as if it had been left for him. He felt his breath hitch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the small recorder and clicked it on without thinking. "This is Mercer," he whispered, voice shaking despite himself. "We're turning back. We saw something on the ridge. Footprints crossed a gap that can't be crossed. One print is still here. It's—" A gust slammed into him so hard he stumbled, catching himself on the rope. The recorder slipped in his glove, nearly falling into the void, but he snatched it back. When he looked up, the others were already moving. He hurried after them. Halfway down the traverse, Marta shouted. Her voice cut through the wind like a blade. Elias spun. She was pointing upslope, eyes wide behind frost-coated goggles. Above them, a figure stood on the ridgeline where the gap had been, on the edge of empty air. Not anchored, not clipped to the rope, just standing. Elias couldn't see a face, only the suggestion of a head turned slightly toward them. The posture wasn't aggressive, it wasn't hurried, it was patient. Raj screamed, "Move!" They moved. They descended fast, too fast, sacrificing caution for speed. Elias felt the familiar danger of rushing at altitude, misplaced crampons, rope tangles, poor footing. He knew the mountain punished panic more reliably than it punished fatigue, but panic had them now. The slope steepened as they approached Camp 3. The tents came into view, small, vulnerable. Elias tasted relief for the first time in hours. Then he saw the tents more clearly. One of them was open. The flap of Raj's spare tent, the one they'd used for gear storage, hung loose in the wind, snapping like a flag of surrender. Raj reached it first, boots punching into the snow, and knelt beside the opening. "Who opened this?" he demanded, though his voice sounded smaller now. No one answered. Elias scanned the camp. Nothing else looked disturbed. No footprints, just the churn of their own tracks from earlier, half filled by snowfall. Raj yanked the flap wider and shone his headlamp inside. His face tightened. "What?" Marta asked, moving closer. Raj didn't reply. He reached in and pulled something out. A glove. Not one of theirs. Old leather, cracked, darkened by age, the fingers stiff as if it had frozen decades ago. A relic. The kind of thing you found half buried on a mountain that kept its dead. Jonas took it from Raj carefully, as if it might crumble. "This is from another time." Keiko filmed, her breath visible, trembling. Elias wanted to tell her to stop. Part of him wanted proof, another part wanted ignorance. Marta looked around sharply. "Where did that come from? That tent was sealed." Raj's eyes flicked to Elias. "You were up early," he said, accusation threaded through exhaustion. "You saw the first prince." Elias stiffened. "You think I planted an antique glove at 8,000 meters? Raj's silence wasn't agreement. It wasn't certainty. It was fear looking for a place to land. Keiko spoke quietly. "This mountain gives back what it wants." The words hung in the air, and in that moment Elias remembered the title of an old climber's story he'd once dismissed as superstition. "The summit isn't the end. It's where the mountain decides." Raj shoved the glove into a pack. "We rest. We regroup. We go down to Camp 2 as soon as weather allows." They crawled into the tents, forcing routine again. Stoves lit, water melted, oxygen checked. Elias sat with his back against the tent wall, recorder in hand, trying to steady his breathing. Then Keiko's voice came through the fabric. "Elias, come out." He hesitated. "Why?" "Just come." He crawled out into the wind. Keiko stood near the rope line, camera in one hand, pointing with the other. Elias followed her finger upward. Above Camp 3, along the slope they'd just descended, the snow was marked by a line of prints, fresh, deep, bare. They weren't leading away from camp. They were leading into it. Elias felt his knees go weak. "That's impossible," he breathed. Keiko's face was pale. "They weren't there a minute ago." Raj emerged beside them, saw the line, and went still. Jonas stepped out next, then Marta. All five stared, bound together by the same silent thought. Whatever was up there had followed them down. The prince reached the edge of camp and stopped, right beside Elias's tent. Elias stared at the final impression, and the cold inside him turned sharp, almost clean, because this one wasn't shaped like the others. This one had something pressed into the snow within the footprint, an object, small and dark, like a stone. Raj moved first, kneeling carefully, gloved hand hovering before he dared touch it. He lifted it from the snow, and Elias's chest tightened when he recognized the shape. It was a metal tag from an old oxygen canister, stamped, weathered but readable. A name, not Raj's, not Jonas's, not Keiko's, not Marta's, Elias's. Raj looked up slowly, eyes narrowed. "How is this here?" Elias couldn't answer. His throat locked, and his mind flashed through every expedition, every lost piece of gear, every moment he'd left something behind on a mountain and assumed it was gone forever. Keiko whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "It knows you." The wind surged, rattling the tents like thin bones, and somewhere above Camp 3, higher than any of them should have been able to hear, there came a sound that wasn't wind, a single, slow exhale, as if the mountain had leaned close to listen to their fear and decided it was ready for the next step. Elias didn't sleep, none of them truly did. At altitude, sleep is a shallow negotiation, your body dropping into darkness for minutes at a time, then snapping awake because it forgot to breathe. But this night at Camp 3 was different. This night had weight, the kind you feel in a room after an argument, when everyone pretends nothing happened, and yet every object seems slightly out of place. The oxygen tag sat in Raj's palm, like an accusation. Elias watched it in the headlamp glow, the stamped letters catching light. Elias Mercer. It looked like the kind of tag you'd clip to gear to identify it quickly. The kind you lose, shrug about, replace. But he hadn't used tags like that in years. Raj's voice was low. "Tell me you recognize it." Elias swallowed. "I recognize the name." "That's not what I asked." Elias stared at the metal. Memory came like a cold needle. A different mountain, a different year, a storm that pinned him above a ridge for 2 days. He'd been younger, more stubborn, more willing to gamble. He'd lost equipment. Everyone did. In his mind, those losses had been left behind, eaten by ice and time. "I used tags like that on my first expeditions," Elias said slowly. 10, maybe 12 years ago." Jonas shifted in the cramped tent, his face hollowed by exhaustion. "So it's old." "It should be," Elias replied. "It shouldn't be here. Not clean, not presented." Marta, sitting near the stove with her hands wrapped around a mug that was mostly melted snow, tried to anchor the moment in something medical. Hypoxia can create patterns. You see connections that aren't real. Keiko didn't even glance at Marta. Her gaze stayed fixed on Elias, calm but unblinking. "That tag did not crawl into the snow by itself," she said. Raj exhaled through his nose and forced command back into his tone. "We descend at first light. No summit, no heroics." No one argued. Outside, the wind hammered the tents in waves, as if something massive paced the perimeter. Elias kept hearing that faint exhale in his mind, the sound the mountain had made, too deliberate to be weather. When the first grey light seeped into the fabric, they moved with the sharp efficiency of people who no longer trusted the environment to remain stable. Packs tightened, lines checked, crampons locked, oxygen adjusted. And still. Elias hesitated before leaving his tent, because he could feel it. The final footprint had stopped beside him last night. Not beside Raj, not beside Keiko's camera bag, beside his tent. As they stepped out, the camp looked strangely untouched for a place that had just hosted something impossible. New snow had drifted, smoothing the surface. Their own tracks from the previous day were softened, blurred, but the line of bear prints was still visible faintly, as if protected by some subtle contour of wind and rock. Raj stared at them for a moment, then turned his back as if refusing eye contact could break a spell. "Clip in," he said. "We move now." They began the descent toward Camp 2, following the fixed ropes down the steep face. The sun rose behind thin cloud, turning the world into a pale, colorless bowl. Below them, the mountain dropped away into cliffs and gullies. Above, the upper ridge was hidden in milky fog. Elias descended last, as he often did, part habit, part responsibility. He kept an eye on everyone's footing, on their rope spacing, on any sign that panic might return, but his attention kept sliding upward. He didn't want to see the silhouette again. He wanted proof that it had been a trick of exhaustion. Half an hour into the descent, the radio on Raj's shoulder, powered off, battery removed, crackled anyway. Not loud, not constant, just one dry burst of static like a throat clearing. Everyone stopped at once. Raj's head snapped down, eyes locked on the dead unit like it had bitten him. "No," he whispered, more to himself than to the team. Keiko lifted her camera. Jonas's hand tightened on the rope until his knuckles whitened. Marta's breathing quickened, audible in her mask. The radio crackled again. Then came the breathing, slow, patient, close. Elias felt his skin tighten beneath layers of insulation. "It can't," he said, but the words were useless. He knew how radios worked. He also knew what he was hearing. Raj ripped the radio from his harness and flung it downhill. The unit tumbled, bouncing against rock, disappearing into a grey pocket of mist below. Everyone watched it vanish like it had been a live grenade. For a moment, there was only wind again. Then, far below, there was a faint crackle, as if the radio had landed and continued to speak from somewhere it could not possibly transmit. Raj's voice shook with anger. "Move! Now!" They resumed descending, faster than was safe, driven by the same urge that pushes animals away from smoke. Elias forced himself to keep movements controlled, to place every crampon point deliberately. But the mountain had learned their rhythm. At a narrow ledge where the rope line forced them to traverse sideways, Keiko slipped. It wasn't a full fall, just a sudden skid when the surface broke under her foot. Jonas grabbed her harness and yanked her back against the wall. Keiko's breath came sharp. "Thank you," she said. Jonas didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the snow. Elias followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. Fresh, bare prints, faint at first, then clearer, appeared along the ledge, parallel to their rope line. They weren't old. They weren't half buried. They were new, pressed into snow that had been smooth moments ago. Marta's voice cracked. "It's with us." Raj's jaw tightened. Stop looking at them. But Elias couldn't. Because the prints weren't just tracking them now. They were weaving. They crossed the rope line, stepped dangerously close to the edge, then returned, as if whoever made them was testing where fear lived in each of them. Then the prince did something Elias couldn't explain even with the most generous imagination. They stopped beside Keiko's boot, and beside that, in the snow, a second set of prints appeared, much smaller, like a child's bare feet. Keiko froze, staring down. "No," she whispered. Her camera tilted, capturing the image as if her hands no longer belonged to her. Elias felt an unexpected squeeze in his chest, something older than fear, something like grief. He didn't know why, but seeing those small impressions up here felt like a violation. Marta leaned close, voice trembling. That's impossible." The child-sized prince took 3 steps toward the edge, then stopped. Then, as if reconsidering, they turned back and walked toward Keiko again. Elias heard himself speak without deciding to. "It's trying to get your attention." Keiko's eyes flicked up, glassy. "It already has it." And then, somewhere above them, behind fog and rock, the silhouette appeared again. Not fully visible, just the suggestion of a shape on the slope, too upright, too still, watching. Raj shouted, "Move!" They moved. And as they descended off the ledge, the child-sized prints were the last thing Elias saw before the fog swallowed them. For the first time, a thought formed that wasn't just fear. It was a terrible kind of logic. What if the mountain wasn't hunting them? What if it was showing them something? What if it was trying to remind each of them of a specific loss, a specific regret? And Elias hadn't yet understood why his name had been chosen. They reached Camp 2 in the late morning, exhausted and shaken, the air slightly thicker but still sharp enough to punish every breath. The camp sat on a broader slope, more sheltered, with a cluster of tents from earlier rotations. It should have felt like safety. Instead, it felt like a room you return to after hearing a noise upstairs, only to realize the house is still not empty. They dropped packs and checked gear, hands moving on autopilot. Raj insisted on a head count, then checked it again, as if numbers could keep the unknown away. Marta started melting snow. Jonas inspected the ropes. Keiko sat alone near her tent, camera in her lap, staring at nothing. Elias walked a few steps away from the group, needing space to hear his own thoughts. He pulled out his recorder. "This is Mercer," he said softly. "We reached Camp 2. Something followed us. It used the radio without power. It left prints beside us, adult and child-sized." Keiko nearly slipped. Jonas caught her. "I don't know what's happening, but I think it's focused on—" He stopped because the wind died, not gradually, not naturally. It died like someone had closed a door. The sudden quiet made every small sound too loud. His own breath, the fabric flutter of tents, the faint clink of carabiners. Elias lowered the recorder and turned slowly. Across the camp, near an abandoned tent that had been half buried by snow, there was movement. Not a person in bright gear, not a climber, a shape. It stood partially behind the tent, as if using it for cover in a way that made no sense. The pale outline was clearer here, lower on the mountain. It was taller than any of them, but not bulky. Long-limbed, narrow, almost too symmetrical, like a figure cut from paper and held upright. Elias didn't shout. He didn't warn the others. He couldn't. Because in that moment the figure raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. Not at the ridge, not at the sky. At Elias. The quiet snapped back into wind, and the figure vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Elias stumbled backward, bumping into a tent line. Raj's voice cut through the camp. "Mercer, what are you doing?" Elias forced himself to sound normal. "Nothing, just checking. Lines." Raj's gaze narrowed. "We're leaving, as soon as we can. Camp 1 by afternoon." They descended again, and the mountain seemed to tolerate it for a while. No new prints, no radio breathing, just wind and ice and the aching simplicity of survival. It almost worked. It almost felt like a nightmare loosening its grip. Then, near a section where the route cut beneath a serac, a looming overhang of ice the size of a building, Elias heard a soft crunch that didn't belong. He looked up. A fracture line spread across the serac like a vein, hairline at first, then widening, then racing. Raj saw it too. His eyes went huge. "Run!" They ran, clipped to the rope, crampons scraping, bodies dragging themselves over uneven snow in blind desperation. The serac groaned, an ancient sound, deep and final. Elias felt time stretch, the way it does when your body decides you might die. A section of ice broke loose above them, tumbling like a slow-motion avalanche, shards spinning. Jonas shouted something. Marta screamed. Keiko slipped, the same cruel slip as before, but this time Jonas couldn't reach her in time. Elias lunged, grabbed her harness strap and yanked with everything he had. His shoulder screamed. Keiko slammed into him, breath knocked out. Behind them the ice hit. A wall of white exploded across the slope, swallowing sound, swallowing light, swallowing the world. Elias clung to the rope and Keiko, bracing, waiting for impact. But the avalanche didn't reach them. It stopped, not gradually as snow does when it loses momentum. It stopped in a sharp boundary, like an invisible line had been drawn across the slope, holding the debris back just meters from their boots. They stood in stunned silence, staring at the edge of the avalanche field. Snow dust drifted in the air, sparkling. The world smelled of fresh ice. Raj's face was pale. "That should have taken us." Marta stepped closer to the boundary, eyes wide. "Why did it stop like that?" Jonas swallowed hard. "Because it wanted to miss." Elias felt his pulse pound. He looked at the avalanche line again and noticed something that made his stomach roll. In the smooth snow just beyond the boundary, where the avalanche should have surged, there were footprints, bare, deep, leading away, as if something had stood there, calmly, and decided where death would end. They reached Camp 1 late afternoon, the air thicker, the horizon wider. Other climbers looked up as they arrived, faces curious, then wary at the look in Raj's eyes. Raj didn't explain. He just ordered their team into their tents and told them they were done. No more ascent. No more delays. They would descend to base as soon as possible. Inside the tent, the 5 of them sat in a tight circle, steam rising from their mugs, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. Keiko finally spoke, voice quiet but steady. "I'm going to show you something," she said. Raj tensed. "If it's footage—" "It's not the prince," Keiko interrupted. "It's earlier, from the ridge." She rewound her camera and played a clip. The screen showed the ridgeline in dawn light, the gap. The far side prints, the moment they crossed into their side. Then the clip jumped to the silhouette above them, faint but visible. Keiko zoomed in. The figure was blurred by distance, but one detail cut through the distortion like a knife. It wasn't wearing gear. It wasn't wearing anything at all. Its skin, or whatever passed for it, looked pale and smooth, almost reflective, as if made of frost. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow. And around its neck, hanging like an old relic, was a metal oxygen tag, swinging lightly. Keiko paused the frame and zoomed further. Pixelated, yes, but readable enough that the letters punched straight through Elias's chest. Elias Mercer. Raj stared at the screen, then at Elias, and for the first time his authority cracked into something raw. "How does it have your name?" Elias couldn't speak. His mind raced backward through years, through storms, close calls, bodies passed on the route, the silent bargains made with mountains. He remembered the expedition 12 years ago, the one he'd barely survived. the one where his partner, a man named Caleb Ward, had vanished in a whiteout near a summit ridge. They'd never found him. They'd found his pack, his rope, a torn glove, but not him. Marta's voice was gentle now, almost afraid to press too hard. "Elias, did you leave someone behind?" Elias's throat tightened until swallowing hurt. "I tried," he said. "I tried to bring him back. The storm—" Jonas leaned forward, eyes sharp. "What mountain?" Elias hesitated, then said it. The name came out like confession. Keiko's expression changed subtly, as if the last missing piece had clicked into place. "And what did you say to him?" she asked quietly. "When you lost him." Elias closed his eyes. He could hear it, the wind, the screaming radio, Caleb's voice breaking. He remembered the last words he'd spoken into that storm, desperate, furious, pleading. He opened his eyes, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I told him to wait at the top." Outside the tent, the wind rose again, rattling the fabric. And from somewhere in the camp, close enough to be just outside their thin walls, there came a slow, deliberate sound. A breath, then another, and a faint scrape, like bare feet shifting in fresh snow, as if something had finally heard Elias admit the truth, and had come to collect what he'd promised. The breath outside their tent didn't belong to any of them. It wasn't ragged like a climber's after a hard traverse. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't panicked, it was slow, measured, almost careful, as if whoever exhaled was practicing what it meant to be human. Elias stared at the tent wall, his mind trying to pretend the sound was wind, forcing its way through seams, but the rhythm was wrong. Too steady, too close. Raj's eyes were fixed on Elias now, as if a single truth had suddenly reorganized the entire expedition. "You told him to wait," he said, voice low, "at the top." Elias didn't answer because speaking felt like stepping onto thin ice. Jonas leaned in, elbows on knees. "Caleb Ward," he said. "Your partner." Elias nodded once. Marta's face softened in a way that made it worse, not better. Pity at altitude was dangerous, like taking off your gloves because you wanted to feel something real. "Elias, what happened?" Elias looked down at his hands, at the cracks in the leather of his gloves, at the dried salt stains. He felt 12 years collapse into one moment of white noise. "We were on a summit ridge," he began. His voice sounded strange to him, like it belonged to someone else. "Not this mountain, a different one. Same kind of exposure. We were late. Weather moved faster than the forecast. It always does." Keiko's camera was resting in her lap now, not filming. She had stopped being a documentarian and become something else, a witness. "The wind hit like a wall," Elias continued. "Visibility went to nothing, just white, no horizon, no sky. We had fixed lines, but they were buried, iced over. Caleb, he was ahead, clipped in, then he wasn't." Raj's jaw tightened. He fell. Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't know. That's the truth. I felt a tug on the rope, like a weight shifting. I shouted, I pulled. I moved forward, crawling because standing was impossible. Then the rope went slack." Jonas's voice was sharp. "If the rope went slack, he unclipped, or the anchor failed." "The anchor held," Elias said. "We checked it. It held." Marta covered her mouth, eyes glossy. "So he unclipped." Elias swallowed. "Or something unclipped him." No one spoke after that. The silence pressed in until the wind outside seemed louder by comparison. Elias's chest tightened as he remembered the radio. Caleb's voice breaking through static, weak and desperate, calling his name. The way the sound kept fading, not with distance, but with something like interference. "I told him to stay put," Elias said. "I told him to wait until I found the line again. I told him—" He stopped, throat locking. Keiko's gaze didn't waver. "You told him to wait at the top." Elias exhaled slowly. He kept saying he was cold, that he couldn't feel his hands, that he couldn't see, and He clenched his jaw hard enough to hurt. I panicked. I said stupid things. I said if he could just get to the ridge, if he could just make it to the summit point, I'd find him, I'd bring him down. I promised him. The breath outside the tent came again, closer, almost directly behind Elias's shoulder. Raj's voice was barely a whisper. And you never did. Elias closed his eyes. The storm pinned me. 2 days. Then rescue forced us down. We searched later. We found gear. Not him. Jonas's expression was grim. And now something is wearing your tag. Elias didn't answer, because a part of him, deep, stubborn, irrational, had begun to suspect the mountain wasn't punishing him for failing to bring Caleb back. It was correcting the mistake. It was delivering the consequences of a promise that had been spoken into a void and still remembered. The tent zipper stirred suddenly, twitching as if a hand had touched it from the outside. Marta gasped and scooted back. Raj grabbed his ice axe instinctively, though he knew how absurd it was. An axe was for ice, for rock, for falls. Not for whatever waited out there. Keiko's voice came soft, controlled. Don't open it. Elias's stomach turned. It wants us to. The zipper tugged again, a gentle pull that made the metal teeth whine. Then the radio, Keiko's camera mic, or someone's spare unit left in a pocket, picked up a whisper of static, a broken thread of sound. Not a word, a syllable. Elias's name again, mangled by distortion, like a mouth learning language. Sir. Elias stared at the flap. He knew something with a certainty that frightened him more than the prince ever had. It wasn't trying to kill them. If it wanted them dead, the Serac would have finished the job. It was trying to finish something else. A conversation left incomplete 12 years ago. A debt. Raj's eyes were furious now, fear turning into anger because anger felt more controllable. We're leaving, he snapped. Now! We go to base tonight if we have to. Marta shook her head. In this weather, we'll die. Raj's gaze flashed. Then we die moving, not waiting for... He stopped, unable to find a word that didn't sound insane. Elias found it for him, waiting for him. Silence. The zipper stopped moving. The tent seemed to hold its breath. Outside, footsteps crunched softly, bare, deliberate, circling once, twice. Not hurried, not searching, claiming. Keiko's hands tightened on her camera. It's listening. Elias felt something shift inside him. Not courage, not calm, but a kind of exhausted clarity. He had spent his life believing the mountain was indifferent, that it was just ice and air and gravity. But indifference didn't leave your name in the snow. Indifference didn't preserve a footprint beside your tent. Indifference didn't stop an avalanche with a clean boundary, like a hand drawn across the slope. He rose slowly, careful not to jostle the others. I'm going out. Raj grabbed his arm. No. Elias looked at him steady. Raj, it's already here. If it wants something from me, we don't get to outvote it. Marta's voice broke. Elias, please, don't. Keiko swallowed hard. If you go, let me film. Elias shook his head. No, not this. He reached for the zipper. The metal felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Raj's grip tightened. If you open that, you risk all of us. Elias met his eyes. If I don't, we risk all of us. For a moment, Raj looked like he might hit him. Instead, he released Elias's arm, anger flickering into resignation. 1 minute, he said. If you're not back in 1 minute, I'm coming after you. Elias nodded once. He unzipped the tent, cold hit like a slap. Wind rushed in, carrying spindrift and the smell of ice. Elias stepped out. The camp lay quiet under fading daylight. Other climbers had retreated into their shelters, either unaware or pretending not to notice. The flags on poles snapped. Snow skittered across the ground in thin ribbons, and there, 3 meters away, stood the figure. It was clearer than it had been above, taller than Elias by at least a head. Its body was pale, but not white like snow, more like skin drained of blood, almost translucent in places. Its limbs were long, joints subtly wrong, as if built to move across terrain without effort. Its head was tilted slightly, curious, and around its neck hung the oxygen tag, swinging gently on a cord, Elias Mercer, the letters catching light like a cruel joke. Elias froze, breath fogging his goggles. His hands wanted to shake, but he forced them still. The figure didn't lunge. It didn't threaten. It just stood there, as if it had walked down from the summit and finally reached the appointment it had been waiting for. Elias swallowed. The words came out hoarse. Caleb. The figure didn't respond in language, but the wind shifted, and Elias heard something, faint like a voice remembered through water. A sound that could have been a name, or a breath. Then the figure lifted one hand. Its fingers were too long, but the gesture was unmistakably human. It pointed upward, toward the mountain. Elias's throat tightened. "You want me to go up?" The figure's head tilted the other way, as if considering his understanding. Then it did something that made Elias's blood go cold. It extended its hand, palm up, and in the center of that palm was something dark against the pale skin. A glove. Old leather. Cracked. Frozen stiff. The same glove Raj had pulled from the storage tent. Caleb's glove. Elias's knees almost buckled. He took a step forward without meaning to. The figure stepped back. One step. Smooth. Not retreating in fear. Leading. Elias felt the camp behind him, Raj's tent, Marta's worry, Jonas's suspicion, Keiko's hungry camera eye. He felt the weight of their survival pressing against his spine. But he also felt something else. A memory sharpened into pain. Caleb's voice in the storm, saying he couldn't feel his hands. Elias had promised, and promises at altitude, spoken with fear in your throat, were still promises. The figure turned, its movements quiet and controlled, and began walking uphill, bare feet leaving clean prints that the wind did not erase this time. Elias followed. He didn't know why he could move. He didn't know how his legs obeyed, but he did. Behind him, Raj hissed his name. "Mercer!" Elias didn't turn, because the moment he looked away, he felt certain the figure would vanish, and whatever chance he had to end this would be gone. They walked past the edge of Camp 1 and onto the route above, upward, back toward the higher slopes where air thinned and the world narrowed into danger again. It was madness. It was suicide. And yet the figure moved like the mountain was a hallway it had memorized. Elias's breathing became harsh. His oxygen flow hissed. The cold bit through his layers. The figure stopped at a point where the route split. One line leading down to base, another leading back up toward Camp 2. It turned. The tag swung. Elias could see now that there were more tags on the cord beneath his own, older, rusted, half buried in frost. Names he couldn't read, other climbers, other promises. Elias's stomach churned. "How many?" he whispered. The figure did not answer, but it lifted the glove and pressed it into the snow between them. Then it pressed its own bare foot beside it, leaving a print. Then slowly it reached toward Elias's chest. Elias flinched, but he didn't back away. The figure's fingers touched the strap of Elias's oxygen harness, lightly, almost gently, and slid down to Elias's pocket where the recorder sat. It tapped the pocket once, like it understood what it was. Then it pointed up again. Elias's voice broke. "You want me to record this?" The figure held still. Elias fumbled the recorder out with trembling hands and clicked it on. "This is Elias Mercer," he said aloud, voice shaking, the words torn by cold and altitude. I'm following something. I believe it's connected to Caleb Ward, my partner. 12 years ago I told him to wait at the top, and now..." The figure stepped closer. It leaned in, head near Elias's, close enough that Elias could see the surface of its skin, fine lines like cracked ice, faint veins of frost. Then it spoke. Not into the radio, not into a device, into the open air, directly into Elias's ear. The voice was wrong and familiar at the same time, like someone mimicking a memory. "Wait, at the top." Elias's stomach flipped. The phrase wasn't just words, it was an echo of his own voice from 12 years ago, returned to him like a boomerang dipped in ice. The figure straightened and began walking again, upward toward Camp 2. Elias followed for another minute, 2. His legs were heavy, his lungs burned. Then Raj caught up. Raj appeared out of the haze, moving fast, clipped into the rope, face contorted with fury and fear. Yunus followed behind, and Marta, and Keiko camera-strapped, ignoring everything but the story. Raj grabbed Elias by the shoulder and yanked him back. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Elias pointed upward with a shaking hand. "It's there." Raj's eyes followed Elias's gesture. The figure stood 10 meters above them, still and patient, like it had expected the others to come. Jonas stopped, eyes wide, and whispered a curse. Marta's breathing turned ragged. "Oh my God." Keiko lifted her camera and filmed. Raj's voice lowered, brittle. "That's not your friend." Elias shook his head. "I don't know what it is, but it has his glove. It has his words. It has my name." The figure raised its hand again and pointed at Elias, then at Raj, then at the rope line down to base. Then, slowly, it pointed at the summit, as if offering a choice. Elias realized with a sick clarity that it wasn't demanding the entire team follow. It was demanding something specific. A return, a completion, a payment. Raj stepped forward, anger flaring. "You want him? Take him!" he shouted into the wind, voice breaking. "You want to kill him? Then do it, but you're not taking us." The figure didn't move. It waited. And then it did the worst thing it could have done. It stepped sideways, off the packed route, and onto a slope that was notoriously unstable. Snow layered over ice, a place climbers avoided because it could slide with the wrong vibration. It planted one bare foot, then another. Then it turned to face them and stood still, as if to say, "Follow me here, prove you mean it." Raj's face drained of color. "It's leading you into a trap." Elias didn't argue because he knew that could be true, but he also knew something else. The Serac had fallen and stopped. Death had been precise. This wasn't random. It was designed. Marta grabbed Elias's sleeve. "You can't. Elias, you can't go up there." Elias looked at her, and the sadness in her eyes pierced him more than fear did. "If I don't," he said quietly, "it won't stop. Not for you, not for Raj, not for anyone. It knows me." Keiko's voice was almost a whisper. "And it has been waiting." Elias turned back to the figure. The tags swung like small graves. The glove sat in the snow like an offering. Elias felt his heart pound against the harness. He clicked his recorder again, voice trembling but clear. "I'm making a decision," he said. "If this recording is found, tell my daughter. Tell her I tried to come home. Tell her—" Raj's hand clamped on his shoulder. "Don't." Elias didn't look at him. "Tell her I'm sorry." He stepped toward the unstable slope. The figure took one step backward, guiding him. Then a sound came from below, shouting, frantic. Other climbers had noticed. Figures emerged from tents, pointing, calling out. The camp had become a crowd of frightened witnesses. Raj turned toward them and screamed for everyone to stay back. But it was too late. Someone, an unknown climber, ran toward the rope line, perhaps trying to help, perhaps driven by panic. And in doing so, they triggered the slope. A low rumble spread through the snow beneath Elias's feet, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The mountain shuddered. The unstable layer began to slide. Elias's stomach dropped. "Down!" Raj shouted. The figure didn't run. It didn't slip. It stood perfectly balanced as the snow around it began to move. Elias lunged backward toward the fixed line. Raj grabbed him, yanked him hard, and Elias slammed into the rope. The slope released with a roar, an avalanche starting not from above, but from beneath them. A sheet of snow broke loose, flowing downhill like a white river. Elias clung to the rope, heart hammering, eyes burning from snow spray. He looked upward through the chaos. The figure remained visible for a moment, upright, calm, tags swinging, standing on moving snow as if it were solid ground. Then it stepped forward toward Elias, across the sliding surface, across moving death. It reached the stable edge of the route and stopped just a meter away from Elias, close enough that Elias could see frost forming on its lashes, if they were lashes. Then it leaned in, and in a voice that was almost Caleb's, almost human, it whispered, "You said, wait." Elias felt tears freeze on his cheeks, and then the figure pressed the glove into Elias's hand. The leather was ice cold, stiff, impossibly real, and with its other hand it reached up and unhooked the tag from around its neck, the one with Elias's name, and placed it in Elias's palm. The metal burned with cold. Elias stared down at it, shaking. "What does this mean?" The figure's head tilted, as if the concept of meaning was something it had learned but never fully understood. Then, slowly, it pointed down the mountain, toward base camp, toward escape. And for the first time, Elias understood. It wasn't taking him, it was releasing him. But release came with conditions. A promise had been made at the summit. A promise had been broken. And now, in the middle of an avalanche, a second promise was being offered, one that could end the waiting. Elias lifted his recorder, voice cracked, speaking as if to the future. "This is Mercer," he said. "If you find this, if you're listening, don't promise things to the mountain you can't keep, and if you leave someone up there, don't tell yourself time will bury it." The avalanche thundered past, finally losing momentum, settling. Silence returned in stunned waves. The figure stood a moment longer, close enough that Elias could smell nothing, no sweat, no breath, only cold. Then it stepped backward into the drifting snow. One step, two, and as the wind rose, it dissolved into the white like frost in sunlight. Gone. Raj's hands were still on Elias, holding him as if he might vanish too. Marta sobbed once, sharply, like she'd been holding it in for hours. Jonas stared at the empty slope, face hollow. Keiko kept filming, until her camera beeped a low battery warning, and even then she didn't stop until her hands finally dropped. Elias looked down at his palms. In one hand, Caleb's glove. In the other, the oxygen tag with his own name. A weight of metal and leather, proof that it had been real. Raj's voice was quiet now, broken. "We go down," he said. Elias nodded, unable to speak. They descended to base camp in silence, the mountain towering behind them like an unreadable god. No more footprints appeared, no more radios breathed, but Elias felt it anyway, a presence that wasn't there, and yet had been. At base camp, in the warmer air, the world began to look normal again. Other climbers talked, laughed, complained about gear. Life resumed its small human rhythms. Elias sat alone outside his tent, glove in his lap, tag in his fist, recorder beside him. He clicked the recorder one last time. "This is Elias Mercer," he said, voice steadier now but heavy. "We made it down. Caleb, if you were waiting, if you're still waiting, then I'm sorry. I shouldn't have told you the top was safety. I shouldn't have made you hold a promise in the cold. If there's any mercy in this world, let my apology reach you where I couldn't." He stopped recording, and in the quiet that followed, he realized something he would carry longer than any summit memory. The summit wasn't the end. It was where the mountain kept its promises, and where it demanded you keep yours too.